Another place. A small group of people was making their way through, walking out onto the pine cone-strewn ground. Rand could see the weaves that made up the gateway. This one had been crafted. Chapter 5. A Tale of Blood. Rand crossed the trampled manor green, banners flapping before him, tents surrounding him, horses whinnying in their pickets on the far west side. In the air hung the sense of an efficient war camp. Smoke and savor from the stew pots were much stronger than the occasional whiff of horse dung or an unwashed body. Bashir's men maintained a tidy camp, busying themselves with the hundreds of little tasks that allowed the army to function. Sharpening swords, oiling leathers, mending saddles, fetching water from the stream. Some practiced charges to the left on the far side of the green in the space between tent lines and the scraggly trees growing alongside the stream. The men held gleaming lances at the level as their horses trampled the muddy ground in a long swath. The maneuvers not only kept their skills sharp, but exercised the horses as well. As always, Rand was trailed by a flock of attendants. Maidens were his guards, and the Aiel watched the Saldaean soldiers with wariness. Beside him were several Aes Sedai. They were always about him now. The pattern had no place for his one-time insistence that all Aes Sedai be kept at arm's length. It wove as it willed, and experience had shown that Rand needed these Aes Sedai. What he wanted no longer mattered. He understood that now. It was little comfort that many of these Aes Sedai in his camp had sworn allegiance to him. Everyone knew that Aes Sedai followed their oaths in their own ways, and they would decide what their fealty to him would require. Elsa Penfell, who accompanied him this day, was one of those who had sworn to him. Of the Green, she had a face that might be considered pretty, if one didn't recognize the ageless quality that marked her as Aes Sedai. She was pleasant for an Aes Sedai, despite the fact that she had helped kidnap Rand and lock him in a box for days, to be pulled out only for the occasional beating. In the back of his mind, Lews Therin growled. That was past. Elsa had sworn. That was enough to allow Rand to use her. The other woman attending him today was less predictable. She was a member of Cadsuane's retinue. Coreel Hovian, a slim yellow with blue eyes, wild dark hair, and a perpetual smile, had sworn no oaths to do as he said. Despite that, he felt a temptation to trust her, since she had once tried to save his life. It was only because of her, Samitsu, and Dahmer Flynn that Rand had survived. One of two wounds in Rand's side that would not heal, a gift from Padan Fain's cursed dagger, still lingered as a reminder of that day. The constant pain of that festering evil overlaid the equal pain of an older wound beneath, the one Rand had taken while fighting Ishamael so long ago. Soon, one of those wounds, or perhaps both, would spill Rand's blood onto the rocks of Shale Ghul. He wasn't certain if they would be what killed him or not. With the number and variety of the different factors competing to take Rand's life, even Mat wouldn't have known which one was the best bet. As soon as Rand thought of Mat, the colors swirled in his vision, forming into the image of a wiry, brown-eyed man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and tossing dice before a small crowd of watching soldiers. Mat wore a grin and seemed to be showing off, which was not unusual, though there didn't seem to be any coin changing hands for his throws. The visions came whenever he thought of Mat or Perrin, and Rand had stopped dismissing them. He did not know what caused the images to appear. Probably his ta'veren nature interacting with the other two ta'veren from his home village. Whatever it was, he used it. Just another tool. It appeared that Mat was still with the band, but was no longer camped in a forested land. It was hard to tell from the angle, but he looked to be outside a city somewhere. At least, that was a large road in the near distance. Rand had not seen the small, dark-skinned woman with Mat for some time. Who was she? Where had she gone? The vision faded. Hopefully, Matt would return to him soon. He would need Matt and his tactical skills at Shale Ghul. One of Bashir's quartermasters, a thick-mustached man with bull legs and a squat body, saw Rand and approached with a quick step. Rand waved the Saldaean back. He had no mind for supply reports at the moment. The quartermaster saluted immediately and retreated. Once, Rand might have been surprised at how quickly he was obeyed, but no longer. It was right for the soldiers to obey. Rand was a king, though he didn't wear the crown of swords at the moment. Rand passed through the green, filled with tents and horse pickets now. He left the camp, passing the unfinished earthen bulwark. Here, pine trees continued down the sides of the gentle slope. Tucked into a stand of trees just to the right was the traveling ground. A square section of ground roped off to provide a safe location for gateways. One hung in the air at that moment, an opening to another place. A small group of people was making their way through, walking out onto the pine cone-strewn ground. Rand could see the weaves that made up the gateway. This one had been crafted with sardine. Most of the people in the group wore the colorful clothing of sea folk. The men bare-chested, even in the chill spring air. The women in loose, bright blouses. All wore loose trousers, and all had piercings in their ears or noses. The complexity of the adornments was of each person's relative status. As he waited for the sea folk, one of the soldiers who guarded the traveling ground approached Rand with a sealed letter. The letter would be one sent via Ashaman from one of Rand's interests in the East. Indeed, as he opened it, he found it was from Darlin, the tyrant. Rand had left him with orders to gather an army and prepare for marching into Arad Doman. That gathering had been completed for some time now, and Darlin wondered, yet again, about his orders. Could no one simply do as they were told? "Send a messenger," Rand said to the soldier, impatiently tucking the letter away. "Tell Darlin to continue recruiting. I want him to draft every tyrant who can hold a sword and either train him for combat or send him to work in the forges. The last battle is close. There he is." "Yes, my Lord Dragon," the soldier said, saluting. "Tell him that I will send an Ashaman when I want him to move," Rand said. "I still intend to use him in Arad Doman, but I need to see what the Aiel have discovered first." The soldier bowed and retreated. Rand turned back to the sea folk. One of them approached him. "Cora Moore," she said, nodding. Harina was a handsome woman in her middle years, with white streaking her hair. Her Afa-on-the-air blouse was of a bright blue, colorful enough to impress a tinker, and she had an impressive 5 gold rings in each ear, as well as a nose chain strung with gold medallions. "I did not expect you to come and meet us personally," Harina continued. "I have questions for you that could not wait." Harina looked taken aback. She was the Sea Folk ambassador to the Koramor, which was their name for Rand. They were angry with Rand for the weeks he had spent without a Sea Folk minder. He had promised to keep one with him at all times. Yet Loghain had mentioned their hesitation to send Harina back. Why was that? Had she achieved greater rank, making her too important to attend him? Could one be too important to attend the Koramor? Much about the Sea Folk made little sense to him. "I will answer if I can," Harina said guardedly. Behind her, porters moved the rest of her belongings through the gateway. Flynn stood on the other side, holding the portal open. "Good," Rand said, pacing back and forth before her as he spoke. At times, he felt so tired, so weary to his bones that he knew he had to keep moving, never stopping. If he did, his enemies would find him. Either that or his own exhaustion, both mental and physical, would drag him down. "Tell me this," he demanded as he paced. "Where are the ships which have been promised? The demonic people starve while grain rots in the east. Loghain said you had agreed to my demands, but I have seen nothing of your ships. It has been weeks." "Our ships are swift," Harina said testily. "But there is a great distance to travel. and we must go through seas controlled by the Shongshan. The invaders have been extremely diligent with their patrols, and our ships have had to turn back and flee on several occasions. Did you expect that we would be able to bring your food in an instant? Perhaps the convenience of these gateways has made you impatient, Koromor. We must deal with the realities of shipping and war, even if you do not. Her tone implied that he would have to deal with those realities in this case. I expect results, Rand said, shaking his head. I expect no delays. I know you do not like being forced to keep your agreement, but I will suffer no lagging to prove a point. People die because of your slowness. Arena looked as if she'd been slapped. Surely, she said, the Koromor does not imply that we would not keep to our bargain. The sea folk were stubborn and prideful, wave mistresses more than most. They were like an entire race of Aes Sedai. He hesitated. I should not insult her so. Not because I am frustrated about other things. No, he finally said. No, I do not imply that. Tell me, Harina, were you punished much for your part in our agreement? I was hung up by my ankles naked and strapped until I could scream no more. As soon as the words left her mouth, her eyes opened in shock. Often, when influenced by Rand's Ta'veren nature, people said things they did not intend to admit. So harsh, Rand said, genuinely surprised. It was not so bad as it could have been. I retained my position as wave mistress for my clan. But it was obvious she had lost a great deal of face, or incurred great toll, or whatever the blasted seafolk called honor. Even when he wasn't present, he caused pain and suffering. I am glad you have returned, he forced himself to say. No smile, but a softer tone. That was the best he could do. You have impressed me, Harina, with your level-headedness. She nodded in thanks to him. We will keep our bargain, Koromor. You needn't fear. Something else struck him. One of the original questions he'd come to ask her. Harina, I would ask you a somewhat delicate question about your people. You may ask, she said carefully. How do the seafolk treat men who can channel? She hesitated. That is not a matter for the shoreband to know. Rand met her eyes. If you agree to answer, then I'll answer a question for you in return. The best way to deal with the Atha An'Mier was not to push a bully, but to offer trade. She paused. If you give me 2 questions, she said, I will answer. I will give you 1 question, Harina, he said, raising a finger. But I promise to answer you as truthfully as I can. It is a fair bargain, and you know it. I have little patience right now. Harina touched her fingers to her lips. It is agreed, then, under the light. It is agreed, Rand said, under the light. My question? Men who can channel are given a choice, Harina said. They can either step from the bow of their ship holding a stone, which is also tied to their legs, or they can be dropped off on a barren isle with no food or water. The second is considered the more shameful option, but some few do take it, to live for a brief time longer. Not much different from what his own people did in gentling men, truth be told. Saidin is cleansed now, he said to her. This practice must stop. She pursed her lips, regarding him. Your man spoke of this, Koromor. Some find it difficult to accept. It is true, he said firmly. I do not doubt that you believe it to be so. Rand gritted his teeth, forcing down another burst of anger, his hand forming a fist. He had cleansed the taint. He, Rand al'Thor, had performed a deed the likes of which had not been done since the Age of Legends. And how was it treated? With suspicion and doubt. Most assumed that he was going mad and therefore seeing a cleansing that had not really happened. Men who could channel were always distrusted. Yet they were the only ones who could confirm what Rand said. He'd imagined joy and wonder at the victory, but he should have known better. Though male Aes Sedai had once been as respected as their female counterparts, that had been long ago. The days of Jorlan Corbeson had been lost in time. All people could remember now was the breaking and the madness. They hated male channelers, yet in following Rand, they served one. Did they not see the contradiction? How could he convince them that there was no longer reason to murder men who could touch the one power? He needed them. Why, there might be another Jorlan Corbeson among the very men the sea folk tossed into the ocean. He froze. Jorlan Corbeson had been one of the most talented Aes Sedai before the breaking, a man who had crafted some of the most amazing tir-en-grial Rand had ever seen. Except Rand had not seen them. Those were Lews Therin's memories, not his. Jorlan's research facility of Sharam had been destroyed, the man himself killed, by the backlash of power from the Boar. Oh, light, Rand thought with despair. I'm losing myself in him. The most terrifying part was that Rand could no longer make himself wish to banish Lews Therin. Lews Therin had known a way to seal the Boar, if imperfectly. Rand had no idea how to approach the task. The safety of the world might depend on the memories of a dead madman. Many of the people around Rand appeared shocked, and Harina's eyes were both uncomfortable and a little frightened. Rand had been muttering to himself again, he realized, and he cut off abruptly. I accept your answer, he said stiffly. What is your question of me? I will ask it later, she said, once I have had a chance to consider. As you wish. He turned away, his retinue of Aes Sedai and maidens and attendants following. The traveling ground guards will see you to your room and carry your luggage. There was a veritable mountain of that. Flynn, to me. The elderly Ashaman jumped through the gateway, motioning for the last of the porters to trot back to the docks on the other side. He let the portal twist back into a slash of light and vanish, then hurried after Rand. He spared a glance and a smile for Kiriel, who had bonded him as her warder. I apologize for taking so long to return, Lord Dragon. A leathery face and only a few wisps of hair on his head. He looked a lot like some of the farmers Rand had known back in Emond's Field, though he had been a soldier for most of his life. Flynn had come to Rand because he wanted to learn healing. Rand had turned him into a weapon instead. You did as ordered, Rand said, walking back toward the green. He wanted to blame Harina for the prejudices of an entire world, but that was not fair. He needed a better way, a way to make everyone see. I've never been exceptional at making gateways, Flynn continued. Not like Androl. I needed to... Flynn, Rand said, cutting in. Enough. The Ashaman blushed. I apologize, my Lord Dragon. To the side, Kiriel laughed softly, patting Flynn on the shoulder. Don't mind him, Damar, she said in a lilting Mirandian accent. He's been as surly as a winter thunderhead all morning. Rand glared at her, but she just smiled good-naturedly. Regardless of what the Aes Sedai thought of men who could channel in general, the ones who had taken Ashaman as warders seemed as protective of them as mothers of their children. She had bonded one of his men, but that did not change the fact that Flynn was one of his men. An Ashaman first and foremost, a warder second. What do you think, Elza? Rand said, turning from Kiriel to the other Aes Sedai. About the taint and what Harina said. The round-faced woman hesitated. She walked with hands behind her back, dark green dress marked only by subtle embroideries. Utilitarian for an Aes Sedai. If my Lord Dragon says that the taint has been cleansed, the woman said carefully, then it is certainly improper to express doubt of him where others can hear. Rand grimaced. An Aes Sedai answer for certain. Oath or no oath, Elsa did as she wished. Oh, we were both there at Shadar Logoth, Kirill said, rolling her eyes. We saw what you did, Rand. Besides, I can feel male power through dear Damar here when we link. It has changed. The taint is gone. Bright as sunlight it is, though channeling the male half still feels like a wrestling with a summer whirlwind. Yes, Elsa said. But be that as it is, you must realize how difficult it will be for others to believe this, Lord Dragon. During the time of madness, it took decades for some people to accept that the male Aes Sedai were doomed to go insane. It will likely take longer for them to overcome their distrust, now that it has been ingrained for so long. Rand gritted his teeth. He had reached a small hill at the side of the camp, just beside the bulwark. He continued up to the top, Aes Sedai following. Here, a short wooden platform had been erected, a fire tower for launching arrows over the bulwark. Rand stopped at the top of the hill, maidens surrounding him. He barely noticed the soldiers who saluted him as he looked over the Saldaean camp with its neat tent lines. Was this all he would leave to the world? A taint cleansed, yet men still killed or exiled for something they could not help? He had bound most nations to him, yet he knew well that the tighter one tied a bale, the sharper the snap of the cords when they were cut. What would happen when he died? Wars and devastation to match the breaking? He hadn't been able to help that last time, for his madness and grief at Ilyena's death had consumed him. Could he prevent something similar this time? Did he have a choice? He was ta'veren, the pattern bent and shaped around him. And yet he had quickly learned one thing from being a king. The more authority you gained, the less control you had over your life. Duty was truly heavier than a mountain. It forced his hand as often as the prophecies did. Or were they both one and the same? Duty and prophecy. His nature as a ta'veren and his place in history. Could he change his life? Could he leave the world better for his passing, rather than leaving the nations scarred, torn, and bleeding? He watched the camp, men moving about their tasks, horses nosing at the ground, searching for patches of winter grass that had not already been chewed to their roots. Though Rand had ordered this army to travel light, there were still camp followers. Women to help with meals and laundry, blacksmiths and farriers to tend horses and equipment, young boys to run messages and to train on the weapons. Saldaea was a borderland, and battle was a way of life for its people. I envy them sometimes, Rand whispered. My lord? Flynn asked, stepping up to him. The people of the camp, Rand said. They do as they are told, working each day under orders, strict orders at times. But orders are not. Those people are more free than I. You, Lord, Flynn said, rubbing his leathery face with an aged finger. You are the most powerful man alive. You're ta'veren. Even the pattern obeys your will, I should think. Rand shook his head. It doesn't work that way, Flynn. Those people out there, any one of them could just ride away. Escape if they felt like it. Leave the battle to others. I've known a few Saldaeans in my day, my lord, Flynn said. Forgive me, but I have doubts that any one of them would do that. But they could, Rand said. It's possible. For all their laws and oaths, they are free. Me? I seem as if I can do as I wish, but I am tied so tightly the bonds cut my flesh. My power and influence are meaningless against fate. My freedom is all just an illusion. Sometimes. Flynn folded his hands behind his back, obviously uncertain how to respond. We all do as we must. Moiraine's voice from the past returned to his memory. as the pattern decrees. For some, there is less freedom than for others. It does not matter whether we choose or are chosen. What must be, must be. She had understood. I'm trying, Moraine, he thought. I will do what must be done. My Lord Dragon, a voice called. Rand turned toward the sound and saw one of Bashir's scouts running up the hill. The maidens cautiously allowed the youthful, dark-haired man to approach. My lord, the scout said, saluting. There are Aiel on the outskirts of the camp. We saw two of them prowling through the trees about half a mile down the slope. The maidens immediately began to move their hands, speaking in their clandestine hand talk. Did any of those Aiel wave at you, soldier? Rand asked dryly. My lord? The man asked. Why would they do that? They're Aiel. If you saw them, that means they wanted you to. And that means they're allies, not foes. Inform Bashir they will be meeting with Rourke and Bale shortly. It is time to secure Arad Daman. Or maybe it was time to destroy it. Sometimes it was difficult to tell the difference.
Maurice spoke. Grendal's plans. Tell me again what you know of them. The tall Aes Sedai of the Green Aja, like Cadsuane herself, maintained a stern expression, arms folded beneath her breasts. A silver comb slid into the side of her black hair. The Tarabonner woman was a good choice to lead the interrogation, or at least she was the best choice Cadsuane had. Maurice didn't show a bit of discomfort at being so near to one of the most feared beings in all of creation, and she was relentless in her questioning. She did try a little too hard to prove how stern she was. The way she kept her hair pulled back into its bun with such force, for instance, or the way she flaunted her Ashaman border. The room was on the second floor of Rand al'Thor's Domani mansion, the outer wall made of thick, round pine logs, the inner walls of wood planks, all stained a matching dark color. This chamber, which had once been a bedroom, had been emptied of nearly all furniture. There was not even a rug on the sanded wood floor. In fact, the only furniture in it now was the stout chair Cadsuane sat in. Cadsuane sipped her tea, intentionally projecting an air of composure. That was important, especially if one wasn't anything near composed on the inside. At the moment, for instance, Cadsuane wanted to crush the teacup between her hands, then perhaps spend an hour or so stamping on the shards. She took another sip. The source of her frustration, and the object of Maurice's questioning, hung in the air, held upside down by weaves of air with her arms tied behind her back. The captive had short, wavy hair and dark skin. Her face matched Cadsuane's own for composed serenity, despite her circumstances. Wearing a simple brown dress, the hem held up around her legs by a weave of air to keep it from obscuring her face, held, bound, and shielded, the prisoner somehow seemed the one in control. Maurice stood in front of the prisoner. Narishma leaned against the wall, the only other one in the room. Cadsuane did not control the questioning herself. Not yet. Letting another lead the interrogation worked to her advantage. It let her think and plan. Outside the room, Ariane, Serene, and Nasuna held the prisoner's shield, two more than were normally considered necessary. One did not take chances with the Forsaken. Their prisoner was Semirhage, a monster who many thought was simply a legend. Cadsuane did not know how many of the stories about the woman were true. She did know that Semirhage was not easily intimidated, unsettled, or manipulated, and that was a problem. Well, Maurice demanded. My question. You have an answer? Semirhage regarded Maurice, icy contempt in her voice as she spoke. Do you know what happens to a man when his blood is replaced with something else? I did not. He dies. Of course, Semirhage said, cutting Maurice off with words like knives. The death often happens instantly, and quick deaths are of little interest. With experiment, I discovered that some solutions can replace blood more effectively, allowing the subject to live for a short time after the transfusion. She said, answer the question, Maurice said, or out the window you will hang again, and the transfusion itself requires use of the power, of course. Semirog interrupted again. Other methods are not quick enough. I invented the weave myself. It can suddenly and instantly pull the blood from a body and deposit it in a bin, while at the same time taking a solution and pressing it into the veins. Maurice gritted her teeth, glancing at Narishma. The Ashaman wore a coat and trousers of black as usual, his long dark hair in braids woven with bells on the ends. He lounged against the long wall. He had a boyish face, but displayed a growing edge of danger. Perhaps that came from training with Maurice's other warders. Perhaps it came from associating with people who would put one of the Forsaken to the question. My warning, Maurice began again. I had one subject survive an entire hour after the transfusion, Semirog said in a calm, conversational tone. I count it as one of my greatest victories. He was in pain the entire time, of course. True pain. Agony that he could feel in every vein of his body, right down to the near invisible ones in his fingers. I know of no other way to bring such suffering to every part of the body at once. She met Maurice's eyes. I will show you the weave someday. Maurice paled just slightly. With a whip of her hand, Cadsuane wove a shield of air around Semirog's head to block her from hearing, then wove fire and air into two small balls of light, which she placed directly in front of the Forsaken's eyes. The lights weren't bright enough to blind or damage her eyes, but they would keep her from seeing. That was a particular trick of Cadsuane's. Too many sisters would think to deafen a captive, yet leave them capable of watching. One never knew who had learned to read lips, and Cadsuane had little inclination to underestimate her current captive. Maurice glanced at Cadsuane, a flash of annoyance in her eyes. You were losing control of her, Cadsuane said firmly, setting her tea on the floor beside her chair. Maurice hesitated, then nodded, looking truly angry, likely at herself. This woman, nothing works on her, she said. She never changes the tone of her voice, no matter what we do to her. Every punishment I can think of only creates more threats, each one more gruesome than the last. What? She gritted her teeth again, refolding her arms and breathing deeply through her nose. Narishma straightened as if to walk over to her, but she waved him back. Maurice was appropriately firm with her warders, though she did snap at anyone else who tried to keep them in their places. We can break her, Cadsuane said. Can we, Cadsuane? Faw. Of course we can. She is human just like anyone else. True, Maurice said. She's been living for 3,000 years. 3,000, Cadsuane. You spent the bulk of that time imprisoned, Cadsuane said with a dismissive sniff. Centuries locked up in the Dark One's prison, likely in a trance or hibernation. Subtract those years, and she'd be no older than any of us. A fair sight younger than some, I would imagine. It was a subtle reminder of her own age, something rarely discussed among Aes Sedai. The entire conversation about age was, in fact, a sign of how uncomfortable the Forsaken made Maurice. Aes Sedai were helpless for hearing and calm. The reason that Cadsuane had kept them outside the room, they gave away too much. Even the normally unflappable Maurice lost control far too often during these interrogations. Of course, Maurice and the others, like all the women in the tower these days, still fell short of what an Aes Sedai should be. These younger Aes Sedai had been allowed to grow soft and prone to bickering. Some had allowed themselves to be bullied into swearing fealty to Randar IV. Sometimes Cadsuane wished she could simply send them all to penance for a few decades. Or maybe that was just Cadsuane's age speaking. She was old, and that was making her increasingly intolerant of foolishness. Over 2 centuries ago, she'd sworn to herself that she'd live to attend the last battle, no matter how long that took. Using the one power lengthened one's years, and found the determination and grit that stretched those years even further. She was one of the oldest people alive. Unfortunately, her years had taught her that no measure of planning or determination could make life turn out as you wanted. That didn't stop her from being in love when it didn't. The years would also have taught her patience, but it had done the opposite. The older she grew, the less inclined she was to wait, for she knew she didn't have many years left. Anyone who claimed that old age had brought them patience was either lying or senile. She can be broken, Cat said. I am not some woman who knows weaves from the age of simply dance herself to execution. We are going to pull every scrap of knowledge from that woman's brain if we have to turn a few of her own creative weaves on her. The Adam, if only the Lord Dragon would let us use it on her, Maurice said, glancing at Semirog. If ever Cadsuane had been tempted to break her word, it was regarding that. Slip an Adam on them. But no. In order to force someone to talk with an Adam, you had to give them pain. It was the same as torture, and Althor had forbidden it. Semirog had closed her eyes against Cadsuane's lights, but she was still composed, controlled. What was going on in that woman's mind? Did she wait for rescue? Did she think to force them to execute her so that she could avoid true torture? Did she really assume that she'd be able to escape, then wreak vengeance on the Aes Sedai who had questioned her? Likely the last, and it was hard not to feel at least a hint of apprehension. The woman knew things about the One Power that hadn't survived even in legends. 3,000 years was a long, long time. Could Semirog break through a shield in a way that was unknown? If she could, why hadn't she already? Cadsuane wouldn't be entirely comfortable until she was able to get her hands on some of that forkroot tea. Your weaves. You can release them, Cadsuane, Maurice said, standing. I have composed myself. I fear we will have to hang her out the window for a time, as I said. Perhaps we can threaten her with pain. She can't know of Althor's foolish requirements. Cadsuane leaned forward, releasing the weaves that hung the lights before the Forsaken's eyes, but not removing the shield of air that kept her from hearing. Semirog's eyes snapped open, then quickly found Cadsuane. Yes, she knew who was in charge. The two locked eyes. Maurice continued to question, asking about Grendal. Althor thought the other Forsaken might be somewhere in Arad Doman. Cadsuane was far more interested in other questions, but Grendal made an acceptable starting point. Semirog responded to Maurice's questions with silence this time, and Cadsuane found herself thinking about Althor. The boy had resisted her teaching as stubbornly as Semirog resisted questioning. Oh, true, he had learned some minor things. How to treat her with a measure of respect. How to at least feign civility, but nothing more. Cadsuane was a failure. And this was not a failure, not yet. But she was close. That boy was destined to destroy the world, and maybe save it, too. The first was inevitable. The second, conditional. She could wish the two were reversed, but wishes were about as useful as coins carved from wood. You could paint them however you wanted, but they remained wood. She gritted her teeth, putting the boy out of her mind. She needed to watch Semirog. Each time the woman spoke, it could be a clue. Semirog returned her stare, ignoring Maurice. How did you break one of the most powerful women who had ever lived? A woman who had perpetrated countless atrocities during the Days of Wonder, before even the Dark One's release. Meeting those black onyx eyes, Cadsuane realized something. Althor's prohibition on hurting Semirog was meaningless. They could not break this woman with pain. Semirog was the great torturer of the Forsaken, a woman intrigued by death and agony. No, she would not break that way, even if the means had been allowed them. With a chill, looking into those eyes, Cadsuane thought she saw something of herself in the creature. Age, craftiness, and unwillingness to budge. That then left a question for her. If given the task, how would Cadsuane go about breaking herself? The concept was so disturbing that she was relieved when Coril interrupted the interrogation a few moments later. The slender, cheerful Mirandian was loyal to Cadsuane and had been on duty watching over Althor. Coril's word that Althor would be meeting soon with his Aiel chiefs brought an end to the interrogation, and the three sisters maintaining the shield entered and towed Semirag off to the room where they would set her bound and gagged with flows of air. Cadsuane watched the Forsaken go, carried on weaves of air, then shook her head. Semirag had been only the day's opening scene. It was time to deal with the boy.
Chapter 6. When Iron Melts. Rodo Ituralde had seen a lot of battlefields. Some things were always the same. Dead men like piles of rags lying in heaps. Ravens eager to dine. Groans, cries, whimpers, and mumbles from those unlucky enough to need a long time to die. Each battlefield also had its own individual print. You could read a battle like the trail of passing game. Corpses lying in rows that were disturbingly straight indicated a charge of footmen who had been pressed against volleys of arrows. Scattered and trampled bodies were the result of before heavy cavalry. This battle had seen large numbers of Seanchan crushed up against the walls of Darluna, where they had fought with desperation, hammered against the stone. One section of wall was completely torn away where some Damani had tried to escape into the city. Fighting in streets and among homes would have favored the Seanchan. They hadn't made it in time. Ituralde rode his roan gelding through the mess. Battle was always a mess. The only neat battles were the ones in stories or history books. Those had been cleansed and scoured by the abrasive hands of scholars looking for conciseness. Aggressor won, 53,000 killed, or defender stood, 20,000 fallen. What would be written of this battle? It would depend on who was writing. They would neglect to include the blood, pounded into the earth to make mud, the bodies broken, pierced, and mangled, the ground torn in swaths by enraged Damani. Perhaps they would remember the numbers. Those often seemed important to scribes. Half of Ituralde's 100,000 dead. On any other battlefield, 50,000 casualties would have shamed and angered him. But he'd faced down a force 3 times his size, and one with Damani at that. He followed the young messenger who had fetched him, a boy of perhaps 12, wearing a Seanchan uniform of red and green. They passed a fallen standard, hanging from a broken pole with the tip driven into mud. It bore the sign of a sun being crossed by 6 gulls. Ituralde hated not knowing the houses and names of the men he was fighting, but there was no way to tell with the foreign Seanchan. The shadows cast by a dying evening sun striped the field. Soon a blanket of darkness would cradle the bodies, and the survivors could pretend for a time that the grassland was a grave for their friends, and for the people their friends had killed. He rounded a small hillock, coming to a scattered pattern of fallen Seanchan elite. Most of these dead wore those insect-like helms, bent, cracked, or dented. Dead eyes stared blankly from openings behind twisted mandibles. The Seanchan general was alive, if just barely. His helmet was off, and there was blood on his lips. He leaned against a large, moss-covered boulder, back supported by a bundled cloak as if he were waiting for a meal to be delivered. Of course, that image was marred by his twisted leg and the broken haft of a spear punching through the front of his stomach. Ituralde dismounted. Like most of his men, Ituralde wore workers' clothing, simple brown trousers and coat borrowed off of the man who had taken Ituralde's uniform as part of the trap. It felt odd to be out of uniform. A man like this General Turin did not deserve a soldier in drab. Aitaralda waved the messenger boy to stand back, out of earshot, then approached the Shonchan alone. "You're him, then," Turin said, looking up at Aitaralda, speaking with that slow Shonchan drawl. He was a stout man, far from tall, with a peaked nose. His close-cropped black hair was shaved 2 finger widths up each side of his head, and his helm lay beside him on the ground, bearing 3 white plumes. He reached up with an unsteady, black-gloved hand and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. "I am," Aitaralda said. "They call you a great captain in Terraban." "They do." "It's deserved," Turin said, coughing. "How did you do it? Our scouts..." His cough consumed him. "Rakan," Aitaralda said once the cough subsided. He squatted down beside his foe. The sun was still a sliver in the west, lighting the battlefield with a glimmer of golden red light. "Your scouts see from the air, and truth is easy to hide from a distance." "The army behind us?" "Women and youths, mostly," Aitaralda said. "A fair number of farmers as well, wearing uniforms taken from my troops here." "And if we'd turned and attacked?" "You wouldn't have. Your Rakan told you that you were outnumbered. Better to chase after the smaller force ahead of you. Better than that, to head for the city your scouts say is barely defended, even if it means marching your men near to exhaustion." Turin coughed again, nodding. Yes. But the city was empty. How did you get troops into it?" "Scouts in the air," Aitaralda said. "Can't see inside buildings." "You ordered your troops to hide inside for that long?" "Yes," Aitaralda said, "with a rotation allowing a small number out each day to work the fields." Turin shook his head in disbelief. "You realize what you have done?" he said. There was no threat in his voice. In fact, there was a fair amount of admiration. "High Lady Siroth will never accept this failure. She will have to break you now, if only to save face." "I know," Aitaralda said, standing. "But I can't drive you back by attacking you in fortresses. I need you to come to me." "You don't understand the numbers we have," Turin said. "What you've destroyed today is but a breeze compared to the storm you've raised. Enough of my people escaped today to tell of your tricks. They will not work again." He was right. The Shonchan learned quickly. Aitaralda had been forced to cut short his raids in Terraban because of the swift Shonchan reaction. "You know you can't beat us," Turin said softly. "I see it in your eyes, great captain." Aitaralda nodded. "Why then?" Turin asked. "Why does a crow fly?" Aitaralda asked. Turin coughed weakly. Aitaralda did know that he could not win his war against the Shonchan. Oddly, each of his victories made him more certain of his eventual failure. The Shonchan were smart, well-equipped, and well-disciplined. More than that, they were persistent. Turin himself must have known from the moment those gates opened that he was doomed. But he had not surrendered. He had fought until his army broke, scattering in too many directions for Aitaralda's exhausted troops to catch. Turin understood. Sometimes surrender wasn't worth the cost. No man welcomed death, but there were far worse ends for a soldier. Abandoning one's homeland to invaders. Well, Aitaralda couldn't do that. Not even if the fight was impossible to win. He did what needed to be done, when it needed to be done. And right now, our Daman needed to fight. They would lose, but their children would always know that their fathers had resisted. That resistance would be important in 100 years, when a rebellion came. If one came. Ituralde stood up, intending to return to his waiting soldiers. Turin struggled, reaching for his sword. Ituralde hesitated, turning back. "Will you do it?" Turin asked. Ituralde nodded, unsheathing his own sword. "It has been an honor," Turin said, then closed his eyes. Ituralde's sword, heron-marked, took the man's head a moment later. Turin's own blade bore a heron, barely visible on the gleaming length of blade the Seanchan had managed to pull. It was a pity that the two of them hadn't been able to cross swords, though in a way these past few weeks had been just that, on a different scale. Ituralde cleaned his sword, then slid it back into its sheath. In a final gesture, he slid Turin's sword out and rammed it into the ground beside the fallen general. Ituralde then remounted, nodding farewell to the messenger, made his way back across the shadowed field of corpses. The ravens had begun.
"I've tried encouraging several of the serving men and palace guards," Lyanna said softly, sitting beside the bars of her cell. "But it's hard." She smiled, glancing at Egwene, who sat on a stool outside the cell. "I don't exactly feel alluring these days." Egwene's responding smile was wry, and she seemed to understand. Lyanna wore the same dress that she'd been captured in, and it had not yet been laundered. Every third morning she removed it and used the morning's bucket of water, after washing herself clean with a damp rag, to clean the dress in her basin. But there was only so much one could do without soap. She braided her hair to give it a semblance of neatness, but could do nothing about her ragged nails. Lyanna sighed, thinking of those mornings spent standing in the corner of her cell, hidden from sight, wearing nothing while she waited for the dress and shift to change. Just because she was Domani didn't mean she liked parading about without a scrap on. Proper seduction required skill and subtlety. Nudity used neither. Her cell wasn't bad, as cells went. She had a small bed, meals, plenty of water, a chamber pot that was changed daily. But she was never allowed out, and was always guarded by two sisters who kept her shielded. The only one who visited her, save for those trying to pry information from her regarding traveling, was Egwene. The Amyrlin sat on her stool, expression thoughtful. And she was Amyrlin. It was impossible to think of her any other way. How could a child so young have learned so quickly? That straight back, that poised expression. Being in control wasn't so much the power you had, but the power you implied that you had. It was much like being a man, actually. "Have you heard anything?" Lyanna asked. "About what they plan to do with me?" Egwene shook her head. Two yellow sisters sat chatting nearby on the bench, lit by a lamp on the table beside them. Lyanna hadn't answered any of the questions her captors put to her, and Tower law was very strict about the questioning of fellow sisters. They couldn't harm her, particularly not with the power, but they could just leave her alone to rot. "Thank you for coming to see me these evenings," Lyanna said, reaching through the lattice of bars to take Egwene's hand. "I believe I owe my sanity to you." "It is my pleasure," Egwene said, though her eyes showed a hint of the exhaustion she undoubtedly felt. Some of the sisters who visited Lyanna mentioned the beatings Egwene was suffering as penances for her insubordination. Odd how a novice to be instructed could be beaten, but a prisoner to be interrogated could not. And despite the pain, Egwene came to visit Lyanna in the cell virtually every night. "I will see you free, Lyanna," Egwene promised, still holding her hand. "Elida's tyranny cannot last. I'm confident it won't be long now." Lyanna nodded. letting go and standing up. Egwene took hold of the bars and pulled herself to her feet, cringing ever so slightly at the motion. She nodded farewell to Lyanna, then hesitated, frowning. What is it? Lyanna asked. Egwene took her hands off of the bars and looked at her palms. They seemed to be coated with a reflective, waxy substance. Frowning, Lyanna looked at the bars and was shocked to see Egwene's handprints on the iron. What in the light? Lyanna said, poking at one of the bars. It bent beneath her finger like warm wax on the lip of a candle's bowl. Suddenly the stones beneath Lyanna's feet shifted, and she felt herself sinking. She cried out. Globs of melted wax started to rain down from the ceiling, splattering across her face. They weren't warm, but they were somehow liquid. They had the color of stone. She gasped, panicked, stumbling and sliding as her feet sank deeper in the too slick floor. A hand caught hers. She looked up to where Egwene had grabbed her. The bars melted out of the way as Lyanna watched, the iron drooping to the sides, then liquefying. Help! Egwene screamed at the yellows outside. Burn you! Stop staring! Lyanna scrambled for purchase, terrified, trying to pull herself along the bars toward Egwene. She grasped only wax. A lump of bar came loose in her hand, squishing between her fingers, and the floor warped around her, sucking her down. And then threads of air seized her, yanking her free. The room lurched as she was tossed forward into Egwene, knocking the younger woman backward. The two yellows, white-haired Musarin and short Galarna, had jumped to their feet, and the glow of Saidar surrounded them. Musarin called for help, watching the melting cell with wide eyes. Lyanna righted herself, scrambling off of Egwene, her dress and legs coated with the strange wax, and stumbled back away from the cell. The floor here in the hallway felt stable. Light. How she wished she could embrace the source herself. But she was too full of fork root, not to mention the shield. Egwene climbed to her feet with a hand from Lyanna. The room fell still, lamp flickering, all of them staring at the cell. The melting had stopped. The bars split. The top halves frozen with drips of steel on their tips. The lower halves bent inward. Many had been flattened to the stones by Lyanna's escape. The floor inside the room had bowed inward, like a funnel, the rocks stretching. Those stones bore gashes where Lyanna's scrambling had scored them. Lyanna stood, her heart beating, realizing that only seconds had passed. What should they do? Scuttle away in fear? Was the rest of the hallway going to melt, too? Egwene stepped forward, tapping her toe against one of the bars. It resisted. Lyanna took a step forward, and her dress crunched, bits of stone like mortar falling free. She reached down and brushed at her skirt, and felt rough rock coating it instead of wax. These sorts of events are more frequent, Egwene said calmly, glancing at the two yellows. The Dark One is getting stronger. The last battle approaches. What is your Amyrlin doing about it? Musarin glanced at her. The tall, aging Aes Sedai looked deeply disturbed. Lyanna took Egwene's lead, forcing herself to be calm as she stepped up beside the Amyrlin, chips of stone falling from her dress. Yes, well, Musarin said, you shall return to your rooms, novice. And you... She glanced at Lyanna, then at the remains of the cell. We will have to relocate you. And get me a new dress as well, I assume, Lyanna said, folding her arms. Musarin's eyes flickered at Egwene. Go. This is no longer your business, child. We will care for the prisoner. Egwene gritted her teeth, but then she turned to Lyanna. Stay strong, she said, and hurried away, heading down the hallway. Exhausted, disturbed by the stone-warping bubble of evil, Egwene walked with swishing skirts toward the tower wing that contained the novices' quarters. What would it take to convince the foolish women that there wasn't time to spare for squabbling? The hour was late, and few women walked the corridors, none of them novices. Egwene passed several servants bustling at late-night duties, their slippered feet falling softly on the floor tiles. These sectors of the tower were populated enough that lamps burned on the walls, trim glow, giving an orange light. 100 different polished tiles reflected the flames, looking like eyes that watched Egwene as she walked. It was hard to comprehend that this quiet evening had turned into a trap that nearly killed Lyanna. If even the ground itself could not be trusted, then what could? Egwene shook her head, too tired, too sore to think of solutions at the moment. She barely noticed when the floor tiles turned from gray to a deep brown. She just continued on into the tower wings, counting the doors she passed. Hers was the 7th. She froze, frowning at a pair of brown sisters, Maynadrin, a Selvain, and the two had been speaking in hushed whispers, and they frowned at Egwene as she passed them. Why would they be in the novices' quarters? But wait, the novices' quarters didn't have brown floor tiles. This section should have had nondescript gray tiles, and the doors in the hallway were spaced far too widely. This didn't look at all like the novices' quarters. Had she been so tired that she'd walked in completely the wrong direction? She retraced her steps, passing the two brown sisters again. She found a window and looked out. The rectangular white expanse of the tower wing extended around her, just as it should. She wasn't lost. Perplexed, she looked back down the hallway. Maynard folded her arms, regarding Egwene with a set of dark eyes. Nagain, tall and spindly, stalked up to Egwene. "What business have you here this time of night, child?" she demanded. "Did a sister send for you? You should be back in your room for sleep." Wordlessly, Egwene pointed out the window. Nagain glanced out, frowning. She froze, gasping softly. She looked back in at the hallway, then back out, as if unable to believe where she was. In minutes, the entire tower was in a frenzy. Egwene, forgotten, stood at the side of a hallway with a cluster of bleary-eyed novices, as sisters argued with one another in tense voices, trying to determine what to do. It appeared that 2 sections of the tower had been swapped, and the slumbering brown sisters had been moved from their sections on the upper levels down into the wing. The novices' rooms, intact, had been placed where the section of brown sisters had been. Nobody remembered any motion or vibration when the swap happened, and the transfer appeared seamless. A line of floor tiles had been split right down the middle, then melded with tiles from the section that had shifted. "It's getting worse and worse," Egwene thought, as the brown sisters decided, for now, that they would have to accept the switch. They couldn't very well move sisters into rooms the size that novices used. That would leave the browns divided, half in the wing, half in their old location, with a clump of novices in the middle of them. A division aptly representative of the less visible divisions the Ajas were suffering. Eventually, exhausted, Egwene and the others were sent off to sleep, though now she had to trudge up many flights of stairs before reaching her bed. Chapter 7. The Plan for Arach Doman. "A storm is coming," Nynaeve said, looking out the window of the manor. "Yes," replied Daigyan from her chair by the hearth, without bothering to glance at the window. "I think you might be right, dear. I swear it seems as if it has been overcast for weeks." "It has been a single week," Nynaeve said, holding her long, dark braid in one hand. She glanced at the other woman. "I haven't seen a patch of clear sky in over 10 days. Daigyan frowned. Of the white Aja, she was plump and curvaceous. She wore a small stone on her forehead, as Moiraine had so long ago, though Daigyan's was an appropriately white moonstone. The tradition apparently had something to do with being a Kyrian noblewoman, as did the 4 colored slashes the woman wore on her dress. 10 days, you say?" Daigyan said. "Are you certain?" Nynaeve was. She paid attention to the weather. That was one of the duties of a village wisdom. She was Aes Sedai now, but that didn't mean she stopped being who she was. The weather was always there, in the back of her mind. She could sense the rain, sun, or snow in the wind's whispers. Lately, however, the sensations hadn't been like whispers at all. or like distant shouts growing louder, or like waves crashing against one another, still far to the north, yet harder and harder to ignore. Well, Dagian said, I'm certain this isn't the only time in history that it has been cloudy for 10 days. Nynaeve shook her head, tugging on her braid. It's not normal, she said. And those overcast skies aren't the storm I'm talking about. It's still distant, but it's coming. And it is going to be terrible. Worse than any I've ever seen. Far worse. Well then, Dagian said, sounding slightly uncomfortable. We will deal with it when it arrives. Are you going to sit down so that we can continue? Nynaeve glanced at the plump Aes Sedai. Dagian was extremely weak in the power. The White might just be the weakest Aes Sedai that Nynaeve had ever met. By traditional, yet unspoken rules, that meant that Nynaeve should be allowed to take the lead. Unfortunately, Nynaeve's position was still questionable. Egwene had raised her to the shoal by decree, just as she'd raised her. There had been no testing, nor had Nynaeve sworn on Oath. To most, even those who accepted Egwene's place as the true Amerlin, those omissions made Nynaeve something less than an Aes Sedai. Not an accepted, but hardly equal to a sister. The sisters with Cadsuane were particularly bad, as they hadn't declared for either the White Tower or the rebels. And the sisters sworn to Rand were worse. Most were still loyal to the White Tower, not seeing a problem with supporting both Elaida and Rand. Nynaeve still wondered what Rand had been thinking, allowing sisters to swear fealty to him. She'd explained his mistake to him on several occasions, quite rationally, but talking to Rand these days was like talking to a stone, only less effective and Dagian was still rather than provoke her, Nynaeve did so. Dagian was still suffering from having lost her warder, Edom, and Ashaman during the fight with the Forsaken. Nynaeve had spent that fight completely absorbed by providing Rand with immense amounts of Saidar to weave. Nynaeve could still remember the sheer joy, the awesome euphoria, strength, and sheer feel of life that had come from drawing that much power. It frightened her. She was glad the ter'angreal she'd used to touch that power had been destroyed. But the nailed ter'angreal was an access key to a powerful sa'angreal. As far as Nynaeve knew, Rand had not been able to persuade Cadsuane to return it to him. As well she shouldn't. No human being, not even the Dragon Reborn, should channel that much of the one power. The things one could be tempted to do. She'd told him to forget about the access key, like talking to a stone. A big red-haired iron-faced stone. Nynaeve laughed at herself. That caused Dagian to raise an eyebrow. The woman was quite good at controlling her grief, though Nynaeve, whose room in the Damani mansion was beside Dagian's, heard the woman crying to herself at night. It was not easy to lose one's warder. Lan. No, best not to think of him at the moment. Lan would be fine. Only at the end of his journey of thousands of miles would he be in danger. It was there he intended to throw himself at the shadow like a lone arrow loosed at a brick wall. No, she thought to herself. He will not be alone. I saw to that. Very well, Nynaeve said, forcing herself to focus. Let us continue. She showed no deference to Dagian. She was doing this woman a favor, distracting her from her grief. That was how Coreel had explained it anyway. It wasn't certainly for Nynaeve's benefit that they met. She had nothing to prove. She was Aes Sedai, no matter what the others thought or implied. This was all just a ruse to help Dagian. That was it. Nothing else. Here is the 81st week, the White said. The glow of Saidar sprang up around her, and she channeled, crafting a very complex weave of fire, air, and spirit. Complex, but useless. The weave created 3 burning rings of fire in the air, which glowed with unusual light. But what was the point of that? Nynaeve already knew how to balls and balls of light. Why waste time learning weaves that repeated what she already knew, only in a far more complicated way? And why did each ring have to be a slightly different color? Nynaeve waved an indifferent hand, repeating the weave exactly. Honestly, she said, that one seems the most useless of the bunch. What is the point of all these? Daigyan pursed her lips. She said nothing, but Nynaeve knew that Daigyan thought that this all should be far more difficult for Nynaeve than it was. Eventually the woman spoke. You cannot be worried about the testing. The only thing I can say is that you will need to repeat these weaves exactly and do so while undergoing extreme distraction. When the time comes, you will understand. I doubt it, Nynaeve said flatly, copying the weave 3 times over while she spoke. Because, as I believe I've told you a dozen times already, I'm not going to be taking the test. I'm already Aes Sedai. Of course you are, dear. Nynaeve ground her teeth. This had been a bad idea. When she'd approached Coriel, supposedly a member of Nynaeve's own Aja, the woman had refused to acknowledge her as an equal. She'd been pleasant about it, as Coriel often was, but the implication had been clear. She'd even seemed sympathetic. Sympathetic? As if Nynaeve needed her pity. She had suggested that if Nynaeve had 100 weaves each accepted learned for the test to become Aes Sedai, it might help with her credibility. The problem was, this placed Nynaeve in a situation where she was all but treated as a student again. She did see the use in knowing the 100 weaves. She'd spent far too short a time studying them, and virtually every sister knew it. However, by accepting the lessons, she hadn't meant to imply that she saw herself as a student. She reached for her braid, but stopped herself. Her visible expressions of emotion were another factor in how she was treated by the other Aes Sedai. If only she had that ageless face. Bah! Daigyan's next weave made a popping sound in the air, and once again the weave itself was needlessly complex. Nynaeve copied it with barely a thought, committing it to memory at the same time. Daigyan stared at the weave for a moment, a distant look on her face. What? Nynaeve asked testily. Oh, nothing. The last time I made that weave, I used it to startle. Never mind. Eben, her warder, had been young, maybe 15 or 16, and she'd been very fond of him. Eben and Daigyan had played games together like a boy and an elder sister, rather than Aes Sedai and warder. A youth of only 16, Nynaeve thought. Dead. Did Rand have to recruit him? Daigyan's face grew stiff, controlling her emotions far better than Nynaeve would have been able to. Slight sin that I'm never in the same situation, she thought. At least not for many, many years. Lan wasn't her warder yet, but she meant to have him as soon as possible. He was already her husband, after all. It's clear that Nyrelle had the bond. I might be able to help, Daigyan, Nynaeve said, leaning forward, laying her hand on the other woman's knee. If I were to attempt a healing, perhaps. No, the woman said curtly. But I doubt you could help. Anything can be healed, Nynaeve said stubbornly. Even if we don't know how yet. Anything save death. And what would you do, dear? Daigyan asked. Nynaeve wondered if she refused to call her by name on purpose, or if it was an unconscious effect of their relationship. His child with an actual acceptance. To call her Nynaeve might imply equality. I could do something, Nynaeve said. This pain you feel, it has to be an effect of the bond, and therefore something to do with the one power. If the power causes your pain, then the power can take that pain away. And why would I want that? Daigyan asked, in control once again. Well, because it's pain, it hurts. It should, Daigyan said. Eben is dead. Would you want to forget your pain if you lost that hulking giant of yours? Have your feelings for him cut away like some spoiled chunk of flesh in an otherwise good roast? Nynaeve opened her mouth, but stopped. Would she? It wasn't that simple. Her feelings for Lan were genuine and not due to a bond. He was her husband, and she loved him. Daigyan had been possessive of her warder, but it had been the affection of an aunt for her favored nephew. It wasn't the same. But would Nynaeve want that pain taken away? She closed her mouth, suddenly realizing the honor in Daigyan's words. I see. I'm sorry. It is nothing, dear, Daigyan continued. The logic of it seems simple to me at times, but I fear that others do not accept it. Indeed, some might argue that the logic of the issue depends on the moment and the individual. Shall I show you the next week? Yes, please, Nynaeve said, frowning. She herself was so strong in Makawa, one of the strongest alive, she often took no thought for her ability. It was much as a very tall man rarely paid attention to other people's heights. Everyone else was shorter than he, and so their different heights didn't matter much. What was it like to be this woman who had spent longer as an accepted than anyone else in memory? A woman who had barely attained the shawl, doing so, many said, by an eyelash and a whisper. Daigyan had to show deference to all other Aes Sedai. If two sisters met, Daigyan was always the lesser. If more than two sisters met, Daigyan served them tea. Before the more powerful sisters, she was expected to scrape and grovel. Well, not that she was Aes Sedai, but still. There is something wrong with this system, Daigyan, Nynaeve said absently. With the testing? It seems appropriate that there should be some kind of test to determine worthiness, and the performing of difficult weaves under stress strikes me as fulfilling that need. I didn't mean that, Nynaeve said. I mean the system that determines how we are treated by each other. Daigyan flushed. It was inappropriate to refer to another's power in any way. But, well, Nynaeve had never been very good at conforming to other people's expectations, particularly when they expected foolishness. There you sit, she said, knowing as much as any other Aes Sedai, knowing more than many, I'd wager. And the moment any accepted just off apron strings gains the shawl, you have to do what she says. Daigyan's blush deepened. We should move on. It just wasn't right. Nynaeve let the matter drop, however. She'd stepped in this particular pit once before in teaching the kinswomen to stand up for themselves in front of Aes Sedai. Before long, they'd been standing up to Nynaeve, too, which had not been her intention. She wasn't certain she wanted to attempt a similar revolution among the Aes Sedai themselves. She tried to turn back to the tutoring, but that sense of an impending storm kept drawing her eyes to the window. The room was on the second floor and had a good view of the camp outside. It was by pure happenstance that Nynaeve caught a glimpse of Cadsuane. That grey bun set with innocent-looking ter'angreal was obvious even from a distance. The woman was crossing the courtyard, Coriel at her side, walking at a fair clip. What is she doing? Nynaeve wondered. Cadsuane's pace made her suspicious. What had happened? Something to do with Rand? If that man had gotten himself hurt again... Excuse me, Daigyan, Nynaeve said, standing. I just remembered something that I must see to. The other woman started. Oh, well, all right then, Nynaeve. We can continue another time, I suppose. It wasn't until Nynaeve had hurried out the door and down the stairs that she realized Daigyan had actually used her name. She smiled as she walked out onto the green. There were Aiel in the camp. That itself wasn't uncommon. Rand often had a complement of maidens to act as guards. But these Aiel were men, wearing the dusty brown Cudinsor and carrying spears at their sides. A fair number of them wore the headbands bearing Rand's symbol on them. That was why Cadsuane had been in such a hurry. If the Aiel clan chiefs had arrived, then Rand would be wanting to meet with them. Nynaeve strode across the green, which wasn't very green at all, in a huff. Rand hadn't sent for her. Probably not because he didn't want to include her, but because he was just too wool-headed to think of it. Dragon Reborn or not, the man rarely thought to share his plans with others. She would have thought that after all this time, he would have realized the importance of getting advice from someone a little more experienced than he. How many times now had he gotten himself kidnapped, wounded, or imprisoned because of his rashness? All these others in camp might bow and scrape and dote on him, but Nynaeve knew that he was really just a sheep herder from Emmons Field. He still got into trouble the same way he had when he and Matrim had pulled pranks as boys. Only now, instead of flustering the village girls, he could throw entire nations into chaos. On the far northern side of the green, directly opposite the manor house, close to the front of the bulwark, the Aiel newcomers were setting up their camp, complete with tan tents. They arranged them differently than the Saldeans. Instead of straight rows, the Aiel preferred small groups, organized by society. Some of Bashir's men called greetings to passing Aiel, but none moved to help. Aiel could be a prickly bunch, and while Nynaeve found the Saldeans to be far less irrational than most, they were borderlanders. Skirmishes with Aiel had been a way of life for them in earlier years, and the Aiel War itself was not so distant. For now, they all fought on the same side, but that didn't keep the Saldeans from stepping a little more carefully, now that the Aiel had arrived in force. Nynaeve scanned for signs of Rand or any Aiel she knew. She doubted that Avienda would be with the group. She would be back in Caemlyn with Elaine, helping secure the throne of Andor. Nynaeve still felt guilty for leaving them, but somebody had needed to help Rand cleanse saidin. That wasn't the sort of thing you left him to do alone. Now where was he? Nynaeve stopped at the boundary between the Saldeans and the new Aiel camp. Soldiers carrying lances nodded to her in respect. Aiel in brown and green glided across the grass, their motions smooth as water. Women in blues and greens carried wash from the stream beside the manor house. Broad-needled pines shivered in the wind. The camp bustled like the village green at Beltane. Which way had Cadsuane gone? She sensed channeling in the northeast. Nynaeve smiled, setting off with a determined step, yellow skirt swishing. The channeling would either be an Aes Sedai or a wise one. Sure enough, she soon saw a larger Aiel tent erected at the corner of the green. She strode straight for it, her stares, or perhaps her reputation, encouraging Saldean soldiers to get out of her way. The maidens guarding the entrance did not try to stop her. Rand stood inside wearing black and red, leafing through maps on a sturdy wooden table, his left arm held behind his back. Bashir stood at his side, nodding to himself and studying a small map he held before him. Rand looked up as Nynaeve entered. When had he started looking so much like a warder, with that instant glance of assessment? Those eyes which picked out every threat, body tense as if expecting an attack at any time. I should never have let that woman take him from the Two Rivers, she thought. Look what it's done to him. She immediately frowned at her own foolishness. If Rand had stayed in the Two Rivers, he would have gone mad and perhaps destroyed them all, assuming, of course, the Trollocs, the Fades, or the Forsaken themselves hadn't accomplished the task first. If Moiraine hadn't come for Rand, he'd now be dead. With him would have gone the light and hope of the world. It was just hard to abandon her old prejudices. Ah, Nynaeve, Rand said, relaxing and turning back to his maps. He motioned for Bashir to inspect one of them, then turned back to her. I was about to send for you. Ruark and Bale are here. Nynaeve raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. Oh? She asked flatly. And here I'd assumed that all the Aiel in the camp meant we had been attacked by Shaido. His face hardened at her tone, and those eyes of his grew dangerous. But then he lightened, shaking his head, almost as if to clear it. Some of the old Rand, the Rand who had been an innocent sheep herder, seemed to return. Yes, of course you would have noticed, he said. I'm glad you were here. We will begin as soon as the clan chiefs return. I insisted they see their people settled before we began. He waved for her to sit. There were cushions on the floor, but no chairs. Aiel spurned those, and Rand would want them to be comfortable. Nynaeve eyed him, surprised at how tight her own nerves had become. He was just a wool-headed villager, no matter how much influence he'd found. He was. But she could not shake away that look in his eyes, that flash of anger. Holding a crown was said to change many men for the worse. She intended to see that didn't happen to Rand al'Thor, but what recourse would she have if he suddenly decided to have her imprisoned? He wouldn't do that, would he? Not Rand. Semirhage said he was mad, Nynaeve thought. Said that he heard voices from his past life. Is that what is happening when he cocks his head, as if listening to things that nobody else can hear? She shivered. Min was there in the tent, of course, sitting and reading a book in the corner. The Wake of the Breaking. Min looked too intently at the pages. She'd listened to the exchange between Rand and Nynaeve. What did she think of the changes in him? She was closer to him than anyone. Close enough that if they'd all been back in Emond's Field, Nynaeve would have given the two of them a tongue-lashing strong enough to make their heads spin. Even though they weren't in Emond's Field and she was no longer Wisdom, she'd made certain that Rand knew of her displeasure. His response had been simple. If I marry her, my death will bring her even more pain. More idiocy, of course. If you were planning to go into danger, then it was all the more reason to get married. Obviously. Nynaeve seated herself on the floor, arranging her skirts, and pointedly did not think of Lan. He had such a long distance to cover, and she had to make sure that she was given his bond before he reached
All right,
the light.
everyone. Hope everyone has a good night.